You know, if there's one thing I learned after watching these two Fear Street movies, it's don't mess with witchcraft stuff. If you see a book that says witch markings or whatever, throw it away, return to sender, or just throw it in a dumpster fire. You know what? Do that. What's going on, you guys? James here with another real review, and today we're diving right into the Netflix exclusive horror movie. It's this summer slasher season, guys. Fear Street Part 2, 1978, directed by Leigh Janiak, starring Sadie Sink from Stranger Things, Emily Rudd, and Gillian Jacobs. This is the second film in the trilogy. It ends next week, and yes, you need to watch the first movie, so I recommend you do that if you haven't. Watch my review, which is right at the top of the screen, and then come back and we'll talk about the second part of this Fear Street trilogy. The movie picks up right where we left off and takes us actually back in time into the cursed town of Shadyside, where a killer's murder spree terrorizes Camp Nightwing and turns a summer of fun into a gruesome fight for survival. You know? Sounds like a camp I never want to go to. But guys, before we get into what worked in this movie and what doesn't work in part 2, if it is your first time here at the channel, welcome to Real James, where we talk about movies and TV like this early all the time, so you're not going to want to miss out. Go ahead and hit the big red button below, subscribe to the channel, and tap on that bell so you'll be the first one in the comments. Hit the big thumbs up button if you've been a fan of these Fear Street movies, and get loud down below and let me know what you thought of part 2. Did you like it more than part 1 or a little bit less? Let's talk about it. Alrighty, y'all. Well, you know what? I'm excited to give you my first positive because we're gonna be optimistic. I know I didn't like part 1 of Fear Street, but I'm happy to report that I feel like part 2 is much better. For everything the first film did wrong, which was present a lot of neat ideas but never execute them all the way, part 2 had a more complete and overall experience to it. The story was more interesting, the script was tighter, and even the acting to me felt like it was more balanced. And don't worry, the slasher vibes are still present, and I'm so glad that it didn't just feel like a movie that's paying homage to older horror classics. Instead, I think part 2 stands on its own much more than part 1. And when it comes to our cast here, I actually really love the fact that it's led by Sadie Sink, who is amazing in her role as Ziggy. Ziggy is the younger sister to Cindy Berman, the woman that was called by our leads Deena and Joshua in the first movie. Cindy Berman in this movie, the young Cindy Berman, is played by Emily Rudd, and I loved both of them, but Sadie Sink stole the show for me. She combines a fearless attitude in the face of her peers, but when confronted with the killers, she's incredibly fearful, however still brave and courageous. She really dials into another gear as well in the second half of the movie, delivering not just good moments by herself, but the fact that she's able to just play off her co-stars really well is a treat, and that starts with Emily Rudd. Their back and forth was so fun to watch unfold, and both of them have this love-hate relationship, and it was just nice that this movie gives their characters an arc and time to breathe. None of the pacing felt off or unbalanced. I do think that this was just a movie that flowed much better than the first as well. And of course, it was really neat seeing Benjamin Flores Jr., still my favorite character in the entire series so far, and Kiana Madeira appear, even though it's not for too long at all. They're in the beginning of the movie, and they're in the end, but most of the film takes place literally back in time, so you have to go back in time to go forward and understand what's to come. But not only do we go back in time to focus on Sarah Fier in this witch, we learn a lot about the origin of one of our killers. And when it comes to the kills themselves, I actually thought the kills here were much more gut-wrenching than in the first movie. There are so many standout scenes, and one of them being this moment of dialogue between a couple of characters where there's blood going everywhere and the sound design is disgusting but very effective, and then another in this cave, and that sequence was shot so well, edited very well. It's just a very good bit of filmmaking. And speaking of filmmaking, director Leigh Janiak also builds this atmosphere around Camp Nightwing that made me feel claustrophobic at times. I won't lie to y'all, even though I was watching it in my room, I felt like the walls were closing in, because even though this camp is on a huge plot of land, and yes, we're in the woods, it's a little nod to Evil Dead, I felt like I was getting those vibes, it did feel like, man, things were getting so tense in some moments, not as an overall experience, and we'll talk about that later, but I did feel like some of the moments were me just catching my breath and thinking, okay, well, what's next? And what adds to this atmosphere and the world building in this movie is the soundtrack and the score. The soundtrack, again, is aces. If you've ever listened to the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtracks, Volume 1 or 2, you'll recognize a lot of these songs like Cherry Bomb, and I just really loved all the musical choices here and how they played into the plot. But then you have the score. Man, it is so well done by Marco Beltrami and Brandon Roberts. Both of them are just very good at playing with different instruments and sounds, but it's that choir, all the chanting when they go into the cave or when they're talking about Sarah Fier. Boy, I ain't playing games with that, but it really worked and it was pretty compelling. And while all of that sounds so great, and yes, I did enjoy part 2 more than the first, I still found some problems with this sequel, and that starts with the film itself not being very suspenseful. Part 2 often plays to those cheap jump scares that you come to expect in slasher movies, but then there are loud noises, right? Where alarm clocks sound super loud, and if you're wearing headphones or if you're not, it should make you jump, but we've grown so accustomed, at least I've grown so accustomed to hearing this, seeing this in horror movies that it didn't surprise me, and unfortunately it didn't add to a suspenseful environment. And the lack of suspense for me is a void this movie leaves by the end, and I could never really buy into the scares it tried to produce. And then there's the story, guys. If you remember in my part 1 review, I was not very thrilled and bought into the story in the first movie. I was hopeful for the second, and what I will tell you is that it doesn't really move the needle for me. And because of that, there were so many moments in the final act that never resonated with me or even got me interested in what's to come. And sure, there are twists and turns, but I expected that considering we have one more week left to go with this trilogy. But it's everything that happened beforehand that didn't get me too interested in the storytelling, and you can tell that they were really trying to build this world out. It just never clicked. At least the dialogue felt much more natural here than it did in part 1, because there were some conversations where I thought, you know what? Yeah, I heard people talk like this when I was growing up. And when it comes to the acting outside of our leads, guys, I didn't feel like there were too many performances to rave about. I could tell that the movie was giving a lot more shine to the supporting actors here, similar to what it did in part 1, and there is this one character, Alice, who does get a cool little monologue, and I feel like those are the moments where it should have impacted me, but instead it felt a little bit shallow. I just don't know where the disconnect came, but for me it just feels like maybe they were leaning into the storytelling side of things and they weren't doing it successfully, which left me feeling a little bit empty by the end credits. And as much as I love Gillian Jacobs and she plays Cindy Berman, a very crucial character in the story, I didn't even feel like her acting was all that sharp. And she's a great actress and I love the work she did in Invincible, but here it just doesn't really work too well. And I think it's maybe because this is just a horror movie where you gotta go in knowing that you're not gonna get A+ performances, but I was at least expecting decent performances from the entire cast, but we got that from only a few and the others were a little lacking. But overall, you guys, Fear Street Part 2 1978 is a step up from the first movie, and I can confidently tell you that yeah, I was having fun sometimes, and I just turned my brain off and I just thought this is a summer slasher movie and I can't think too much of it. Like, there should not be any expectations set here to where it's going to really raise the bar for horror movies, but if you're going into this thinking, hey, I like part 1, I think you're going to really love part 2. I love the sound design, I loved how the blood felt so real, and all of the kills definitely impacted me a little bit more. If anything, that's a testament to the character development for Sadie Sink's character and Emily Rudd. I felt like the Berman sisters really were given such shine in this movie, and I love that they kind of completed the arc in a way, even though, of course, we see C. Berman grown up, so there's more than meets the eye there. But I definitely love how this movie was handling both of those characters, and they were the heartbeats for the film. So that's why I do think Fear Street Part 2 is just a more effective horror movie. It's a more complete story, it's a tighter script, and I think that the film is much better for it. So I gave Fear Street Part 1 a 2.5 out of 5, and when I think about Fear Street Part 2, you know what, guys? I'll give it like a 3, like a strong 3 out of 5. Now, I'm hoping Part 3 blows it out the water because there's this little teaser at the end of Part 2, and I thought, Lord Almighty, it's about to get kind of crazy up in here. But I do think that Part 3 will continue this momentum, and I hope it continues to trend up because, hey, Fear Street, this trilogy, it's so unique, it's different. I'm not used to seeing this in the summer, and I love that this has been a hit for Netflix and a lot of people are loving it. So there you have it, you guys. That's my real review of Fear Street Part 2, a summer horror movie that I do recommend because, yeah, it's more fun than the first film. But I need to know what you guys have to say about it, so go ahead and get loud down below in the comments. Let me know, did you like Part 2 just as much as Part 1 or even more? And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the big red button below, subscribe to the channel, and help us get to 5,000 subscribers. We are so close, and it's all because of you. And hey, I can't wait to keep talking about Fear Street, so you know what? Part 3, pencil it in for next week because we'll be back here, not same time and same day. I have to check the embargo on that, but I can't wait to talk about it next week before it drops next weekend. Alrighty, y'all. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you at the next screening. And catch me throwing away any books with any sort of witches on them. I ain't even playing, even Wizard of Oz. No one's safe.